Hello, everyone. Back again. Today I have a special episode because I am joined with Dr. Maurice Hamington, who is professor of philosophy and gender, women's sexuality studies at the University of Portland, or Portland State University. Not University of Portland. Portland State University. You know, that's a thing I've had to get used to, is how every state has, it depends which order you say those three words in, that it'll give you a different institution. But for
Yeah,
those of you
because
that don't know, uh, Dr. Hamington is informed by feminist anti-oppressive thought, and he's written many books, edited many others about care ethics, gender, philosophy, including a number of other topics, political economy, class, and so on. He's one of the world's leading experts on care ethics, which we're going to talk about today, and care theory. That is the subject of his book that we're going to cover, titled Revolutionary Care, that you might be reading backwards as cameras work. I highly recommend it, especially for those people who may not know as much about this topic. It's a very great introduction to it. It does a wonderful way, or it wonderfully introduces the reader into the topic by supplying anecdotes, how these anecdotes relate to care theory, and what we should do as thinkers, as activists, as people to try to make the world a better place. And he's done work across the world, and we'll talk about this a little bit more with care ethicists, sharing knowledge, figuring out how to best put care ethics, care theory into practice. So, Maurice, Dr. Hamington, welcome very much to our show here.
hi, David. It is great to be with you here. I'm a longtime listener of the show. I am a big fan, and you have really helped me understand a lot of philosophical concepts. And I love the way you make philosophy relevant and alive for today's critical issues.
Thank you. I mean, it means a lot coming from you. I take any kind of affirmation I can get because it helps me keep going, but not nearly as important as this kind of work that you've put forward here. And I'm really eager to jump into it. But just to start out, like care theory, care ethics is an ethical system like so many other ones. How is it different from broadly other ethical systems like utilitarianism or Kantianism or any other ones?
It actually started out as in a sense, a kind of critique, particularly of deontological morality. The work of Carol Gilligan back in the 1980s, and very shortly thereafter, Nell Noddings in the 1980s. They were critical of the fact that traditional moral theories did not capture all there is to think about in terms of morality. That's why Carol Gilligan's original and landmark book is called In a Different Voice. And the different voice isn't about male versus female ethics. It was about not paying attention to something very important in morality, and that is relationships and our fundamental relationality. So what makes it different is it comes from a different ontological place, that human beings are at core relational. And if you take that seriously, I mean, it's common for people to say, "Oh yeah, we're social beings," that kind of thing. But if you take our relationality ontologically seriously, it really changes the way you think about things. We live in a neoliberal world. We are very used to thinking transactionally, and a lot of times the ethical systems that operate also tend to be quite transactional. And so I think at a fundamental level, that is what makes it different. But I do want to say it is not a it's not an alternative normative approach in in a global sense. Um, it it has different emphases. It has a different way about going about humanity, but it also shares things with utilitarianism and a Kantian approach and a virtue ethics approach. It shares with all of those. So um, it is a different flavor of normative theory that does a different kind of work, but is not simply like, not like an alternative. It's not like going to the ice cream parlor and saying, I want chocolate or strawberry or vanilla. The care ethics is not one of many. It actually impacts, I mean, it actually engages the other approaches, but differently. Just a quick example, Nell Noddings said that there is a lot that is very much like consequentialism in care ethics because it deals with the consequences of life as it's lived. But she quickly would say, but it is not formulaic. We don't calculate utility and maximize and do that kind of thing. So anyway, that's a little bit longer an answer than you wanted, but
No,
it
great.
gets it gets at the idea that that care ethics is definitely different, worthy of its own field of study, but it is not to say that the other moral approaches don't have very important insights.
Yeah, and all these things can work together. But just to go back to the very beginning of your point there, is that this is largely inspired by feminist thought, Carol Gilligan, including others. And the other thing I want to point to is that you identifying neoliberalism, or at least its tendency to reduce human interaction to a kind of transaction, what we are seeing then is a removal from ourselves as caring beings in favor of a more transactional type interaction with one another. So why does feminism help, dismantle that, or at least at the very least identify and then hopefully dismantle that? What is it about feminism that got you to that point?
Well, it's interesting. The 1980s in Western thinking was a very important time in care thinking. And we think about the 1980s, that's also when academic feminism was beginning to mature and putting out a lot of original work in, standpoint theory and other kinds of areas. And um, what care ethics did it's grounded in women's experience of being marginalized. Women have historically been the harbingers of care, associated with care, particularly in the Western world, to the point where it is a burden. Where women were expected to care selflessly and empty themselves into care. Took that experience, added feminist analysis. The feminist analysis shows the political nature of it, says how the personal is connected to the political, and develops this into a theory of care. And um, and so the feminism it is actually important to the character of care. And for example, when I teach the course, I like to use the term feminist care ethics, and I reference that in my materials as well, because the feminist aspect of it is what gives it its kind of political um, edge. Uh, Now, I do want to mention, I do want to put a footnote in here real quick, and we can go into this further if you wish. But this is the Western philosophical story beginning in the 1980s up until today, so the last 4 decades. But there are uh, cultures, societies, trains of thought, genealogies of thought that have been thinking about care, in different ways, different approaches to it that, far predate this. And we could learn a lot from indigenous societies, from non-Western cultures about care. And in a kind of interesting way, the Western philosophy needed this interjection of care perhaps more because of the embrace of neoliberalism and also a kind of analytic philosophy. I'm not anti-analytic philosophy, but there's a kind of analytic philosophy that eschews the relational and the emotional and the connectedness. And so the interjection was important in Western, but I don't want to fall into the trap of Western exceptionalism, like, look here, look what we did that nobody else has ever done in terms of thinking about care. So anyway, that was my little footnote.
No, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. And some of the ones that you mentioned, or some of the communities you specifically mentioned, include the Zulu, the Cree people, the Venda people, that all, like any community on Earth, employs some kind of knowledge of care and practice of care to care for themselves and to care for their own people. And as you say, it'd be totally wrong to think that somehow the rhetoric of care or the practice of care emerged in 1980s white feminism. But in the way that you identify it, like there were certain problems that the world was confronting, especially with the burgeoning neoliberalism at the time, that required many of these new knowledges that at the time may have been new to the quote unquote Western world, but were nevertheless extremely important. I think that that's really a great point to really emphasize how this isn't a new idea, but it's one that's definitely needed today, and as it was in the 80s. But as far as feminism goes, just because we're on that point, you're also influenced very much by other feminists, like Latina feminists like Gloria Anzaldúa, Maria Lugones, who do a lot in really emphasizing the importance of care, importance of bodies, and importance of relationality, not only to allow for care to flourish between people, but also for each person to really care for themselves, especially in the face of like neoliberal emphases upon the individual that places the individual's worth in their ability to be productive in a capitalist sense, that try to find ways, or these thinkers try to find ways to express oneself in ways that are actually meaningful to them and true to them as a kind of caring for oneself. So how did you get land upon Ansel Lugones and others to help inform this feminist inflection into your care ethics approach?
Well, reading feminist writers, reading Latinx feminist scholars, it becomes clear, that it is fair to criticize um, feminist care ethics as being overly influenced by white feminists and drawing from white feminist experiences, and that is being rectified now. We are getting fantastic work by feminists of color in the United States and all over the world who are reconceptualizing care. There was recently a special issue of a journal called um, Care Ethics Otherwise, where they're taking different identities and their approaches. And people like Gloria Anzaldúa, again, if we broaden out the genealogy, maybe she didn't use the word care ethics, proper, but she was talking about a relational morality way back in her dissertation, and talks about a kind of spirituality that is not, limited to religiosity, but is a kind of relational spirituality, a political spirit that includes the political, very complex interweaving of ideas. This is not, and again, I just kind of make some connections. I don't want to pretend to know or uh, engage in appropriation of these ideas. I would like to see Latinx scholars talk about these issues and expand on this. I think that would be a great uh, care theory, care ethics book to write. Uh, so again, it's the trying to get away from I think the stories told, like if you pick up some encyclopedia entries on care ethics, it strictly goes, okay, Carol Gilligan wrote this in 1982, and Nell Noddings wrote this in subsequent year, and all this kind of thing. And I think uh, that is not complex enough for the story of care ethics.
Absolutely. And I think that as far as your book goes, you do a great job at really emphasizing all of the different components of it. But I mean, this encourages me because you refer to the encyclopedia entry. What really is care ethics and how does it differ from care itself? And you make another distinction, and others make this distinction as well, between care ethics and care theory. How do you
Gr-
parse out the differences between these three things?
Great question. Great question. I think this will be important for your viewers to get, some of these distinctions in mind. So, care, the concept of care is crucial for humanity. We are extremely vulnerable beings. We don't actually even survive if somebody doesn't care for us. Think about a baby. A baby is born, you cannot walk away. There are some animals in the animal world where you can, but not human babies, and not most mammals. Um, they need the care of others. But more than that, care provides for human flourishing. We tell that one story about, like, or humanity is the survival of the fittest. It's a dog eat dog world, and um, uh, it's because of competitiveness that we got to this point. There's an alternative story that is also just as true, that we survived to this point because of care, connection, and compassion. That it is through working together, caring for one another, building one another up, that humanity has gotten to this point. And we forget that story. We don't valorize that story the way we valorize the kind of competitive story of human history. Joan Toronto famously defined care as everything we do to repair this world. And it is true, care is a core concept. She even has this phrase that human beings are homo currens, that we are fundamentally caring people at our core. That doesn't mean we always actualize it, but it is required for our existence and flourishing. So that's care. That's that core, um, uh, you know, fact of our human existence. I mean, you can take away all this theorizing. You can't get away from the fact that uh, we don't survive, we don't grow, we don't achieve if it isn't for care. Um, just a quick aside, when I give a talk now, I do a land acknowledgement. I like to do a job or work, a labor acknowledgement, and I like to do a kind of relational acknowledgement, that I am not here weren't for the relationships and the people that have cared for me to get to this point. And so, when you give a talk, or you write a book, there's only one name, right, associated with it. But that's a misnomer, right? There's all these people, and there's all this, that goes behind it. Anyway, so that, care. So care ethics. So we attach the word ethics to it. This again, this kind of Western notion that comes up in the 1980s, that there's another way to think about moral normativity, about uh, what are the good things to do. And by the way, I want to be careful. I like to use the word uh, good versus the right things to do. Um, I find the dichotomous right and wrong to be very problematic a lot of times, and morality is just so much more than that. So care comes along, and they frame it as an ethic to begin with. Um, to differentiate it from these other approaches, and what does it mean to think about morality from a relational approach? Well, I'll just give you one example, and that is time is different. The temporal range is so much different if you're thinking in relational terms. If you're thinking in transactional terms, what do? You think about what's the right thing to do in that moment, you know, like the famous trolley problem, which you've dealt with at times, various times in your podcast. The trolley problem, it's like, what do I do now, right? Do this or that. But the relational approach is to say, hey, you know, how did we get here? How are we going to care, in the future for the folks involved? What is the relationship here rather than simply the decision? Now, in reality, sometimes we just have to make decisions. I get it, but the a care approach in some ways is more complex than that. The care approach resists um, the reductionism of life. The original studies that Carol Gilligan did, some of the girls and the women who helped her understand a different voice of morality rebelled against the case studies. They asked more questions. They weren't satisfied with the case studies because those are a reduction of life. Um, so care is complex, it's messy, um, but it's another, another form of ethics. Some folks today are um, kind of pushing back on the idea of care as an ethic because ethic brings the baggage of the Western moral tradition with it. That it has to do certain things and it has to have these certain kinds of parameters to it. And so that's why I actually prefer to address care theory. And there are other people are starting to pick up this idea of thinking about care theory because I think care is so important to humanity and so complex that it breaks the boundaries of just a normative theory of deciding, what is the good thing to do. Um, and so care has epistemological aspects to it, how we come to knowledge. There's a whole series of studies on care epistemology, how the relational approach changes the way we engage in knowledge production. Ontology, who we are. Again, if we're fundamentally relational, then caring speaks to what it is to be human, and that going beyond the moral decisions that we make. That in the book, I try to think about care as a way of being, a way of living life, as opposed to narrowing it down to making, solving moral dilemmas kind of thing. So another quick example of why care theory is, more than just an ethic. There's an exciting movement right now. I think this is the future of care theory. There's an exciting move right now to dig into care aesthetics. There is a major study going on in the UK on care aesthetics and scholars who are thinking about that. I've worked with a number of PhD dissertations, people working on care aesthetics, and there's been conferences that focus on care aesthetics. And there is a major publisher that you would know that is considering right now starting a series, a book series on care aesthetics. And I think that speaks to how care is breaking the boundaries of just the field of ethics. And I think it will always have a moral and ethical dimension to it, but it will. But the idea of care theory is that it is just more expansive than that.
Yeah, and I think that's extremely important, especially this effort to try to disaggregate care and the way you want to think about it from the entire history of Western ethical principles that have, to be honest, like have historically been quite prescriptive in trying to find out what is the right course of action in any given situation versus the wrong course of action. It's really tried to supply us with a one size fits all model for how we conduct ourselves in the world. Whereas care acknowledges that the world is not so neat. The world is not so neat, but we know that there are humans and we know that humans have needs. The example I like to give my students is that, to emphasize this relational aspect of our being, of our ontology, if any of our ancestors had at any point told the rest of the group that they wanted to go live out on their own somewhere, you wouldn't be here right now. The only reason you're here right now is because your ancestors worked together, not because they were like, I want to go live alone in my shack, which happens to now, especially following this turn to neoliberalism in the late 70s and into the 80s, where we see this hyper emphasis on the individual. We see more of a need for this emphasis on relationality to get back to our roots, so to speak, which I have some ideas, some prompts about that as we go on. But I wanted to ask, because you mentioned knowledge production and you mentioned some other people's work, what does it look like when carathesists come together, like with your own work and the type of work you've done in other parts of the world? How do you put this, how do you share this knowledge and then put it into practice?
Um, well, as you kind of pointed out at the beginning, care is very contextual, and so the situation itself matters very much. The and that's where epistemology is so important. To be a good care, you need to learn, you need to understand the situation. If I'm going to get around to your question, but if I may take a little bit of a detour, I so in the book I make one other distinction, and that's between care and good care. And so a lot of times we use the word care in a kind of shorthand. We presume that the other person thinks that it is good. But of course, there can be bad care. There can be oppressive. There can be terrible care. Care is the language of the colonizer. Care is also can be the language of the abuser. When care becomes inappropriately paternalistic, then it can be a bad thing. If you study, crip theory, you know that in disability studies, care is often a bad word because it implies the taking away of somebody's autonomy in the name of what's good for them, kind of thing. So, and people engage in all kinds of oppressive acts in the name of care. So I make that distinction because just because somebody invokes the word care, just because somebody says it, I don't think it meets our standard. So I think that's why it's important to distinguish between good care and care. Now, the problem is, and why some theorists don't say that's not possible, is what I said previously. Care is so contextual. And like, who am I, this very highly privileged white male scholar, to say what good care is? Um, and so here is where I do some more, exploring to what I think care theory is. I think it is I think it is a kind of process morality. It is more about methods and skills than it is about prescriptive rules or statements. And so I talk about, when I say good care, I say these are the kinds of things, these are the kinds of skills and methods that can improve care. Now, that doesn't and and that also has an asterisk, because I think of care as a continuum. Depending upon the situation, I don't always need deep kinds of care, right? If somebody is nice to me at the coffee shop, that's pleasant. That's nice. We have a nice exchange. It's a kind of superficial care, and that's all that's required in that particular situation. But for somebody to get the kind of care they need, if they have particular needs or wants or in a situation, something deeper might be required for that. And so I say that if you want to, expand that on that continuum, three things go into good care. The first goes to what we were talking about. It's the epistemological aspect. That's humble inquiry, humble inquiry. I like that phrase because inquiry, taking from John Dewey, who does so much on that, this active form of seeking knowledge, not passive, but actively seeking knowledge, and humble inquiry. Humility is something that doesn't get enough play in modern philosophy. I think it is so important that I go into trying to understand somebody without making that snap judgment, without jumping ahead to the conclusion, but I'm actually present, listening, active listening, trying to understand. So that's the humble inquiry, that knowledge portion of it. The other skill that I think is important is inclusive connection, connecting, figuring out how to connect to the other. And we do that all the time. It is easy for us to connect with familiar others, um, uh, our friends, in our family. Um, um, Nell Noddings used the term natural caring for that situation because it feels like it's natural. I know the natural is a kind of problematic word in philosophy, but it feels like it's natural. And she called ethical caring when you care for others. And so I say inclusive connection because this is to push you beyond just the familiar. And so making the connection, that's where you use your moral imagination. That's where empathy comes into play. And if we really exercise that empathy, then it can also be inclusive. We can see how people who are other than us, different than us, also still share things. And perhaps the most important thing we share is embodiment and the needs of being embodied beings. So 20 years ago, this is how long I've been doing this. 20 years ago, I wrote a book called Embodied Care, where I talked about um, how the body's role in caring. And I think that lays the groundwork for that connection. And then the final thing, the third thing is responsive action. I said how care is uh, like the other morality. So there consequences do matter with care. Care is not simply a disposition. It's not simply me saying, "Oh yeah, I care." It is actually doing something, and but it needs to be responsive to the other person, not any action just to take action, um, and not a rote action. It's like if you go to your doctor and they're not really paying attention to you, and they say, take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning. That's not a responsive action. It's an action. It's not a responsive action. And so taken together, the humble inquiry, the inclusive connection, and the responsive action, I think these are the skills that move us along that continuum from good care from care to good care. A couple other caveats. I'm sorry, one thing always leads to another,
No, it's
but
fantastic. It's great.
but I also think that a care theory, unlike some of the other moral theories, cannot have a standard of perfection. There is no standard of perfection. It is a non-ideal theory in that sense, um, because I will never be a perfect carer. All I can do is hope to improve. And if I do carry myself as a caring person, if I aspire to be caring, if I commit to caring, then I want to improve and be a better carer, improve these skills. So I don't think it has a standard of perfection. And I also don't think it has uh, a standard of selflessness. Care is not altruism. I think you can care and care about yourself at the same time. Again, to get away from the burden that women were and the standard they were held to. Okay, I'm sorry I made all of that. That
Oh,
was all. I haven't even started answering your question. Your question was
fantastic.
how when care ethicists from all over the world and different disciplines, how do they speak to one another? Um, well, let me just say as an aside, the beauty of this community is if this is their field of study, they tend to be um, uh, really caring people. They're really nice people. The people I've met in the caring community, which is awesome. But they have as a baseline valuing care. And that's where we start from. And then we listen to each other in the different contexts that we're coming from and what's going on in that and how they respond and have and within their context. So I spent a month on a Fulbright with French care theorists, and they have a real problem language wise translating care into the French in the way we understand it. And so there is a whole kind of issue there concerning that. Their society has a kind of patriarchal concerns. We do too in the United States, but they're a little different there. And so they think about care a little bit differently. Later this year, I'll be going to Japan for a month, working with Japanese care theorists, and I've already, heard that their context is also very difficult because uh, feminism, while alive in Japan, also has its constraints because of a patriarchal society there. So we come together and we talk about what's going on in our context. We learn from each other, and we approach it very differently. Yesterday, I was listening to a podcast by an analytic philosopher who likes care and and talks about care differently than I do. But again, the value is care. And so we have that as, our touchstone. And then, we try to flesh it out um, accordingly. And hopefully, if we come to it with that kind of humble openness, we can build upon each other's work. I don't I don't come along to this and say, oh, look, I've got it right. Joan Tronto got it wrong, or Nell Noddings didn't get it right. Here's what it. No, what I'm trying to do is think about how we can expand um, this field, how we can value care more. If you go to my website, the first thing you say is the world needs more care, and that's what I'm interested in. That I think that's what most care theorists are interested in.
Yes, and everyone will be able to find a link for your website in the description. But just to reiterate, you identify three common approaches to good care. So on the one hand, you're trying to resist this ideal framework to say that there's this perfect way to do care. Yet on the other hand, you're suggesting that there are these guiding principles, and they are, as you said, humble inquiry, inclusive connection, and responsive action, which are all in themselves a way by which to act in the world. To perform a humble inquiry is to act in some way in the world. Also, to be inclusive in the way that you form a connection with someone is to establish, is to do something in the world. And of course, responsive action is to do something in the world. And all of this happens to dovetail with the broader politics of care. And just for anyone who's listening who happens to be a really big fan of Heidegger, it happens to all fit in with Heidegger. Heidegger has this whole thing in Being in Time about the importance of care. And I think this is all relevant. That is, we are caring beings, as you mentioned in that passage before. Care is what we do to repair the world. Care might also be what we do to build a world, to do things that make sense to us in the world and to care for one another. When you're driving on the road, believe it or not, you're cooperating with people. If you weren't, you wouldn't be able to drive on the road. People have to cooperate, and they're doing so all the time. If people were just driving however they wanted, you would not drive on the road. And all of these things work together in a way, and I think our point to this fundamental nature that we have, nature, of course, like you said, being a problematic term, that we need to care for one another. And I'm reminded of, because I happen to really enjoy Michel Foucault's work, one of his overarching points when he looks at any of the institutions he focuses on, be it the prison, be it the mental asylum, be it the hospital, he identifies that each of these institutions have gone through a historical abstraction of the person, the patient, anyone who's institutionalized, an abstraction of themselves as a person away from that so that they just become then a kind of cog within this larger institutional machine. And I'm just using this example to emphasize how culturally within the West, because this is the arena that I can most easily speak to, we've moved away from care in favor of abstraction to find these like universal ways to treat all people. Like we have, oh, medical care is just the same for everybody. Yet we see in the medical field how women, especially how Black women in the United States, do not get care universally, despite the claim that it's being applied universally. And we see it. And this, all of this to emphasize really the importance of identifying care and trying to employ it, and to really get after, as the book title suggests, how it can be revolutionary, which leads into my next question. What does it mean for care to be revolutionary? Is care in itself just automatically revolutionary? Or any other points you want to make before answering that?
I guess you've gotten used to asking me questions that there's likely to be other points. Well, I think the title revolutionary care in a sense points to this this fundamental uh, dichotomy, it almost seems like an oxymoron, right? Because you say the word care, and for a lot of people, particularly those interested in maybe theory and philosophy, it's almost like it's mundane, it's boring. It's like oh yeah, care, yeah, that's important. Um, and we don't think about it as radical or revolutionary or having that kind of cutting edge to it. But if we imagine a world where we just improved our care skills just a little, so, um, I'm not saying that we all become, tremendously skilled at care, but if we all improved at it a little bit, it could have this ripple effect and change everything. And so I said that I thought of care as a process morality, a process, something where we can improve ourselves and one another. Well, uh, I draw upon a German feminist philosopher, Eva von Redeker. She's got this concept of process revolution. That revolutions, she went back, did some historical analysis, and even the revolutions that we, are in our imagination, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and other countries' revolutions. What do we think about? We think about buildings coming down, people being killed, the overthrow of an oppressive government, that kind of thing. And those things did indeed, happen. But she points out that those were, points of attention in a long process of smaller changes, smaller um, movements in people's minds and thinking uh, that culminated in some of those acts. And she also points out there are many revolutions that occur without such overthrow. I am often um, buoyed, given hope by the transformation that I remember in my own lifetime over the last several decades in thinking in the United States, for example, about same-sex marriage. It wasn't very long ago, and actually, I understand the argument that uh, uh, many people have that gay marriage isn't, the be all end all, that it's got its own baggage to it, and that's not a goal that everybody has. But it still can be a marker of greater acceptance, I think. And I can still remember when states one by one were passing laws that said marriage has to be between a man and a woman. It wasn't that long ago. And then in the span of a decade, and this is, if you go look at Gallup polls, they will say they've never seen social transformation, like this since they've been taking polls. We went, from uh, pushing heterosexual marriage to being okay, generally speaking, with same-sex marriage. And to me, that's a kind of revolution on a small scale. I mean, it could be more, but that we're talking about if we care more. So, what changed in that period of time? Did the big religious institutions change their rules, to make that happen? Uh, you know, what what changed? Well, people's attitudes changed. They uh, they um, they watched um, uh, same-sex couples on TV. The people came out. They realized that these people are like themselves. They had more connection, and um, they cared more, and and so it that kind of fueled a lot of that change. And I think there can be more. We need to have more that we seem to be constantly looking for scapegoats, whether it be people who are transitioning or um, uh, uh, immigrants seeking a better life in the United States. What are those people doing? They want to they want to care for themselves and their families. That's what they want to do. That's what they're after. And why do we want to hinder that? Um, in that, if you um, think about the whole Black Lives Matter movement. I recommend to anybody to go to the Black Lives Movement and read their founding documents and see how inclusive care, is drips throughout those documents. What was the cry? It was, you should care about us. Why don't people care about us? We care about us. Why don't you should care about us. I think you can find um, uh, care in all of this. Um, I think I probably went far afield from your
Oh,
question,
that
but
no, that's great. But it prompted something else in me in that I think that you very correctly identify the value in representation to suggest that like when people see others that they've historically been told to fear or to dislike, when they actually see them, when they meet with them, when they talk with them, and this was I think the subject of at least two of your anecdotes that you use in the book, then they're actually able to see that many of their prejudices were wrong in the past, many of their ideas were wrong, and they get to find this kind of common humanity with this other person. Now, there's also a kind of risk here because at the same time, while representation might be good in some ways on its own to take some people out of their previous negative beliefs about a certain people or community, it also encourages others to further entrench themselves into it. We're perceiving that very representation itself as a threat against them. So there will be a lot of backlash. For example, if a film comes out featuring what have classically been white characters in a franchise, suddenly cast with black characters, there will be this outcry, which is a sign of like just how much more care we really need. So this double-edged sword of representation, the kind of barriers it can confront, while also acknowledging its importance, also acknowledging its importance.
I think you bring up a good point. Nothing about this is formulaic. We're talking about human beings and human relations. And so it doesn't work like it won't automatically happen. We need to commit to care. One of the subtitles of the book is about commitment. I really like the word commitment when it comes to morality because it speaks to my self identification with something rather than a morality imposed from the outside. It's a commitment, and if we commit to care, if we see how it is really the essence of being a moral being, we commit to caring, then hopefully we'll want to improve. Again, never reaching perfection, but at least wanting to improve. And the examples I give at the beginning of these chapters, I like I'm a person who likes to start on the ground. Part of my training was in American pragmatism. And so I really uh, like starting there. And they weren't um, the the stories, the anecdotes, they weren't there to say this is how it's done or you can do this or something like that. They're not necessarily replicable, but I think they give a glimpse of the power of care uh, uh, in them on what an individual can do, the power, the kinds of moral epiphanies that can happen in a caring imagination, the transformations that can occur when we care with one another, sometimes in ways in which rational arguments they can go places that rational arguments can't go. I might have I might I might have all the reasons why something should happen, and maybe I still won't get there. But sometimes caring, can get through.
And to build on this distinction that you put forward between, or maybe identifying the limits of rational inquiry, I'm reminded of Dory Lob's research on the Holocaust. And specifically, Dory Lob writes about his experience as a psychoanalyst at Harvard, working with a bunch of historians looking at a specific incident at Auschwitz where there was a Jewish uprising against their Nazi oppressors, in which they interviewed, or during this study, they interviewed a Holocaust survivor who suggested, and I might get the specific number wrong, that 3 or 4 chimneys had exploded in the process of this revolt. Now, the historians were in the room were like, no, that wasn't true. Actually, it was just one chimney. Therefore, this person's testimony is unreliable. Therefore, we cannot trust them. And Dory Lob heard something else instead. Dory Lob was like, well, actually, even if it isn't like empirically true or historically true, maybe quote unquote rationally true, it nevertheless tells another kind of truth. And that is the truth of Jewish resistance and like a Jewish spirit against the most horrific oppression or one of the most horrific oppressions that any people has ever felt. But that was disregarded by the historians when it didn't absolutely map onto their historical account. So this, I think, reveals, like, to go back to one of your fundamental points, humble inquiry. To be able to say, like, if I'm listening to someone's testimony, there may be moments where I'm like, oh, that's wrong. But humble inquiry would say, no, actually, at least as far as I understand it, I might be wrong. Or maybe there's more to it than just being right and wrong. Maybe there's different truths to extract from those that are just like mathematically true or absolutely historically true.
I love that. I love your answer. I think that's fantastic, and that's a great example that you give. Maybe you could be a care apostle as well. The I think when you do the humble inquiry, elsewhere I have and other people have dealt with the idea of when it comes to care, and particularly if you think about it as embodied care, that the knowledge production is in a sense holistic. And so you're not just listening to the other person just for the facts. You may also be, thinking about how, the pain in their voice, the posture they take. There can be all kinds of in your humble inquiry. There can be all kinds of ways to add to your knowledge, not just uh, thinking about the words and the actual discourse that's there.
Yeah, yeah. And to move us, like, just to guide us a little bit here into the second half of your book, you move from really unpacking the history of this term of care ethics, of care theory, of care itself. And then you provide what I will just very loosely call some prescriptions or maybe some ideas about how to not just implement care on an individual level, but more broadly, societally. And some of the things you advocate for that you find significant value in, although that you're very clear, you approach with a great deal of nuance in the way that you actually understand it, is advocating for a socialist, feminist, humanist, and vegan approach to caring and to structure our society, while also like really wanting to emphasize that these are very obviously these are contested terms, and you take that on and provide your own view into them. How did you like select these four things? What, like, why did they stick out to you? What are some of the specificities of the specific attributes or characteristics of each that you think satisfies some basic human criterion or satisfies some basic human uh, need for care in some way?
Great question. And you framed it just right because again, as a care theorist, I can't be prescriptive. This is not some kind of biblical like book where I'm telling you what to do. The second part of the book I call invitations and provocations. And as you describe, I've tried to just uh, investigate, care. I've made an argument about why a commitment to care should be kind of like a categorical uh, commitment. If this is if you value it as the central moral tenet of being human. Um, and so what I say is, okay, if you commit to care, I think you ought to at least think about these things. I'm not going to tell you you have to do these four things, but here is just some examples, and I explain why, a little bit, with them. And so, for example, the chapter on socialism, I make very clear that I am not an economist. I have an MBA. I have taught economics, but I'm not an economist, and I am not promoting some specific economic system. What I am what I am suggesting is we should think about an economy that is more social centered, something that is more socialistic in its nature. And what does that mean? It means concerns about concentrations of wealth. It means an emphasis on infrastructure, uh, um, uh, you know, and inclusion and caring for all. And we have some wonderful care economists, um, people like Nancy Folbra and others who have written about economics in a more expansive kind of way. And and I think we should bring more imagination to economics. I think one thing that has happened is that neoliberalism and the market in our modern society have become very addictive in the Foucauldian sense of it. They are truth narratives, and I think we need to challenge that with other truth narratives. And I think care is another truth narrative that we need to challenge that with. So uh, again, it's an invitation. And how you asked the question, why did I pick these? I try to pick things that I had some history with, some experience or training in, but also that I thought can be major barriers to people caring more for each other. And so when it comes to market capitalism, we know that caring almost sounds anathema to the concept. I mean, it is very difficult. And I teach business ethics regularly, and I always have something on care ethics there. And again, you'd be surprised how many articles in business ethics journals are based on care ethics. It's actually quite robust. Um, but trying to trying to think about that differently. The second like I say, I went with feminism, and again, that's mostly because there is still a virulent forms of masculinity that I think need to be checked, and which eschew caring. They're um, we see it portrayed in popular media. We still see it valued in the way we talk about political leaders, the masculinity, involved. Um, somebody attacks somebody else, of course we're going to attack with greater force because that's what you do, right? It's a you know, that's the kind of that's the eye for an eye response that you get, and I think there's a lot of masculinity built into a lot of that, and uh, that needs to be confronted. None of these chapters are comprehensive. I didn't do a comprehensive economic analysis. This was not a comprehensive feminist analysis. I just picked a few things that, you know, that I thought were barriers to care. And I think masculinity and patriarchy, you know, are one of those. The,
Yeah,
the,
and they all offer because like you don't have the space to necessarily perform this kind of like deep dive in on the conversation of socialism, for example. Any hardcore Marxists out there might say like, "Oh, this is incredibly idealistic," as though you can just abstract from the actual economic horrors that are found under capitalism to advocate for this hopeful kind of socialistic care one day. Whereas the Marxists are very clear, at least in the dialectical method, is that it's going to come about through like a lot of conflict, through a lot of strife, through a lot of struggle, and it isn't something to necessarily just like offer up as this final solution. But that's not what you're saying. In fact, as far as I grasp it, what you're saying is understanding or using socialism as this template within the economic realm as a way by which to configure our relations with one another while all these other things, important movements go on. And my way of understanding this is simply just harm reduction in as simple a term as possible to make sure that people are kept alive, people are kept safe, and people are cared for. And I think that this extends into your consideration of humanism and veganism as well, and the kind of nuance that you apply to these things.
yeah, very much so. Very well said. Um, I, and I think you bring up a point that I should emphasize. One of the problems in the challenges, I mean, in dealing with concepts such as care and advocating for something like care is such a popular utilized word in this in the world. It appears everywhere. It appears in all kinds of advertising and is co-opted in so many different kinds of ways that people have strong ideas about it. And um, one of the ideas they have is that care means nice, that care means like, oh, it's like a warm hug or something like that. Um, and and that's not entirely true. Um, you know, I think care would seek peace, but just because you're in a caring relationship doesn't mean that it eliminates conflict and disagreement. In fact, if you think about it, you know, think about like the family. That's where we get a lot of our understanding of care from families. But there's all kinds of conflicts in families, and and it's okay because it's within the context of care. And so, in some ways, to care means that you allow for more conflict, more disagreement, and it allows it to come up rather than just suppressing it, and you know, and keeping it under wraps until it explodes. Care means that it can indeed come forward. I'm advising a university right now. They want to have this care campus-wide kind of care program, and I'm you know I'm warning them you got to be careful on this in that you have to really mean it. You can't be engaging in care washing. And don't think that it will mean that there's not going to be conflict on campus, you know, that there actually might, people might be more free to say what they feel in those situations. Uh, so, uh, so you're right. When it comes to something like socialism, yeah, I'm not saying that there won't be people who you know will fight back on this. There won't be people who may lose something if programs like this are put into place, or that there might not even be. I mean, there might be you know violence at times, and uh, care doesn't mean um, necessarily the absence of violence. Uh, but it does mean always kind of problematizing it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's never just violence for violence's sake. And to just, I recall from the end of your book, from the conclusion, when you say that violence in some cases is absolutely necessary, like in the case of self-defense, like in the case of fighting against an oppressor. There are some situations where people are forced to do it largely for care for themselves and care for their own communities. But it's comes down to a question of good care versus bad care, or just or care that is not actually holding up. Like, is the care that's being employed just meant to reflect a certain individual interest, or is it meant to reflect a broader historical struggle against oppression, for example? How are these two things shouldn't be held in the same kind of, it shouldn't be given the same kind of weight or attention. And I think that it's important, as far as researchers, to calibrate our understanding of these things and not just equate any kind of resistance to being good, or thinking that it is doing something in the service of humanity, when at times it can just be done for very selfish purposes, to really improve one's individual position in the world and not actually helping the world itself all that much. And I mean, humanism is a really important thing in this way, like humanism really emphasizing the value of humanity and what unites us as needing care, and maybe unites us among other mammals. Like you said, we are beings that need care. We are beings that need attention, that need to be cared for and to care for others, even if and I think that this happens to also point to this possibility, or advocacy for veganism as an important way to minimize harm, that really the systematic, unimaginable harm that is done to animals on a daily basis all across the world, and done in ways that are not only just violent to animals, but has so many deleterious effects to the environment, that is inadvertently affecting humans in other ways that needs to be dealt with. Even if someone just assumes a selfish, human-centered approach, we still find reasons why veganism is a better alternative than carnism, is the term you use, than just being just being a meat eater and just having absolutely no care in the world from where your food comes from or anything like that, while also acknowledging that not everybody has the opportunity or the privilege to just be vegan. It's a part of a broader movement to minimize harm for ourselves as humans and for our non-human friends and family in this global community.
Yeah. Again, a terrific, description. Um, a big part of caring is to engage your moral imagination, to live. What is the classic philosophers call to live the reflective life, to be thoughtful, and I think bringing care into that is is very important. And I the chapter on humanism is used in a particular way because I'm trying to um, basically juxtapose that against a certain kind of religiosity. And I say that, as a care ethicist, I'm agnostic as to whether you're religious or not. That's not the point. The point is that care has to be the categorical imperative. And when religious prescriptions get in the way of people being able to care for one another, then you need to reconsider those prescriptions. Every religion says something positive about caring, and many of them practice fantastic works of care, but many of them also divide human beings in a way that mitigates care of people of different identities, and that's what's particularly imperative. And then what you said about animals is exactly correct. I left that chapter for last. I knew that would be the most challenging and difficult to put out there, the idea of veganism. But again, if I think about if I think reflectively and imaginatively about how I could make a more caring world, I also have to think about these actions, meals that I take 3 times a day, maybe more, and uh, iterations like that. How can those be more, caring and peaceful? And what uh, what are the horrors that go behind the delivery of certain kinds of foods that aren't seen every day? So um, those examples, I could have had more. In fact, in the original book proposal, I had more, but the publisher and the reviewers felt like I was going on too long. Caring can fit into almost all of our big issues of the day. And um, these are I could have talked about anti-racism more directly. I could have talked about environmentalism more directly, and I mentioned a little bit about this in the final chapter. But these, I just narrowed it down to these major aspects of life. Uh, and and again, as provocations and invitations, um, I don't want people to think that care theorists are just uh, theorizing about non-problematic things. And I wanted to put out there, okay, so here are uh, here are some tough issues and how you might want to think about them.
Yeah, no, and I thought it was fantastic. And definitely on the topic of religion and religiosity, at least in its opposition to, or thinking about it in contrast to humanism, that emphasizes the human and what is important to us, not necessarily reference to divinity as being the determining factor for how we should conduct ourselves in the world, like in a prescriptive way. I too find myself in a similar agnostic, largely a-religious atheist position, who happens to be somebody who really wishes that in a lot of the time that Christians actually adopted the words of Jesus more than they tend to claim they do. I'm like, oh, that might be actually quite good. But while also acknowledging, like you said, the many issues that arise in these kinds of separations on the basis of religion, but also the ways that they, allow for connection and allow people to come together, that provide a sense of community that I think in our world, thinking about the West, where there's this hyper emphasis on individuality, I think that for a lot of people, it gives them that natural sense of care and community that they otherwise won't get when they go to the doctor's office or when
Right.
they are at school. And so there's a lot of value there. Whether or not that's the only way to cultivate care or to bring people together or to organize them around something that is beyond them, is I don't think that has to be the case. But in any way, in any case, I think that it's an important distinction. While for myself, acknowledging some of the values that can be definitely found within religion, within religiosity, in terms of care.
Yes. Agreed. My first PhD was in religion, and my second one was in philosophy, and so I so it's a topic that's uh, uh, quite important to me. But you know I want to bring everybody into this conversation. I really feel that care should be a moral unifier in a way, because it doesn't matter if you're on the left or on the right politically. Um, Everybody needs care, and if we could wrap ourselves around that idea, I think maybe we can create more common ground. Again, all disagreements are not going to go away, but can we have, that essence where the right and left are arguing about how to care for people more rather than, eschewing care altogether.
Yeah, yeah, that's fantastic. Do you have anything else? Any other remarks? Any other ideas you'd like to emphasize?
No, you've done a great job of, I think, going through this book. I hope that your listeners get a little taste of care theory. It is burgeoning all over the world and across disciplines. You can pick up a book on care and law, care on politics, care in anthropology, geography, whatever. I hope that your readers will consider, I mean, your listeners will consider um, uh, doing some more work on care theory, and I welcome. Um, you're welcome to put my email address out there, and people are welcome to contact me and talk about it if they'd like.
Fantastic, fantastic. And I'm definitely going to make that available. And for everyone, once again, for those of you who are watching, this is the cover. Dr. Hamington's book, Revolutionary Care. Definitely recommend you get it, especially as an introductory look into this field. And then from there, you can use the bibliography to go in as many directions as you like and take all of the suggestions that you just got. Well, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much for offering your insights and for all the work that you do in this field, because we need more care theoreticians, ethicists. We need more people conducting care and finding ways to more easily put it into practice for others to, be able to participate in, while not necessarily needing to go through the entire academic ringer of like reading all the books and then figuring out how to best care to, people on your end and other activists, other organizers doing the kind of work to streamline this for everyone else and to really help build this caring community, which maybe the end goal is that the community disappears altogether and then it's just a world that's just caring. Maybe that's the end goal. I don't know, but
That would be great. And thanks, David, for having me on. You are an amazingly welcoming and knowledgeable host. Wonderful to discuss this with you.
thank you so much, Maurice, and we'll be in touch.
Okay.